Hello! Before you settle in, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, only if you like what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'm always curious to see who's joining us from around the world. Caesar, how a kidnapping launched the world's first startup empire. He was a hero, a villain, a tyrant, a god. But for a moment, let us discard these well-worn labels, these titles carved into the marble of history. Let us instead consider a different narrative, one more suited to our age of disruption and ambition. What if Gaius Julius Caesar was not merely a general or a politician in the classical sense? What if he was the world's first and most audacious startup founder? He was a man who looked upon the sprawling 400-year-old behemoth that was the Roman Republic and saw not a sacred institution, but a legacy company, bloated and inefficient, its systems archaic, its board of directors entrenched, and its user base profoundly dissatisfied. A company ripe for a hostile takeover. His product? A revolutionary new vision for Rome. His brand? Himself. His ultimate goal? To seize total market control, to become the CEO of the known world. And his remarkable story, the narrative of this unprecedented corporate raid, does not begin on a triumphant battlefield or in the hallowed halls of the Senate. It begins, as so many entrepreneurial ventures do, with a spectacular failure. It begins with a humiliation. It begins with his own kidnapping. As a young man, full of the unearned confidence of his patrician heritage yet lacking the wealth to back it up, Caesar set sail for Rhodes to study rhetoric under the famed Apollonius Molon, the same tutor who had instructed Cicero. This was no trivial detour. Rhodes was the Ivy League of its day, and Apollonius was its most celebrated professor, known for tempering the florid excesses of Asian-style oratory with a more disciplined, powerful Attic style. It was a finishing school for the global elite. His journey, however, was cut short. His ship was intercepted by Cilician pirates, the undisputed and terrorizing scourge of the Mediterranean. These were not opportunistic thugs. They were a sophisticated, organized network that operated with impunity, running fleets that could challenge naval squadrons and controlling fortified island strongholds across the Anatolian coast. Their business model was simple: kidnapping for ransom, a lucrative trade that preyed on the wealthy and well-connected who plied the sea routes. They operated with the efficiency of a multinational corporation, with intelligence networks that informed them of valuable targets, and a logistical chain for holding hostages and negotiating payments. They sized up their aristocratic captive, observing his fine clothes and patrician bearing, and demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. This was an immense fortune, equivalent to millions of dollars today, enough to secure a comfortable life for any normal man. Caesar, however, was not a normal man. According to the histories, he simply laughed in their faces. With an arrogance that bordered on madness, he told them they clearly had no idea whom they had captured. He informed them that he was worth at least 50 talents. The pirates, utterly bewildered, but also amused by his audacity, agreed. They had just been successfully upsold on their own hostage. For the 38 days he remained their prisoner, he did not act like a captive. He acted like their superior, their leader who had simply deigned to visit. He shushed them when their boisterousness interrupted his work on his speeches and poems. He forced them to listen to the fruits of his literary labour, critiquing their lack of artistic appreciation when they failed to be sufficiently impressed. He joined in their games and exercises, all the while maintaining an air of detached command, and he repeatedly, almost cheerfully, promised them that upon his release he would hunt them down, every last one of them, and have them crucified. They took it as a joke, the empty bravado of a cornered aristocrat trying to maintain his dignity. It was not. Once the 50 talents, a truly staggering sum his associates had to scramble to raise from the cities of Asia Minor, were delivered, and he was set free. Caesar did not retreat to the safety of Rome. He immediately went to the port of Miletus, chartered a small fleet, and raised a force of volunteers, all on his own initiative and without any official authority. He was acting as a private citizen, a private military contractor on a mission of personal justice. He then sailed back to the pirate stronghold. He caught them completely by surprise, still celebrating their windfall. He captured them, recovered his ransom plus all their accumulated treasure, and then, making good on his promise, he did exactly what he said he would do. After taking them to Pergamum and imprisoning them, he went to the provincial governor to demand their official execution. When the governor, likely hoping for a hefty bribe from the pirates himself, equivocated, Caesar took matters into his own hands. He returned to the prison and had every single one of them crucified. In a small act of mercy he would later become famous for, he had their throats slit first to spare them a lingering death on the cross. This singular episode was far more than a simple act of vengeance. It was a mission statement, a foundational document for the enterprise he was about to build. It demonstrated a mind that could turn a liability into an asset, a crisis into an opportunity. He did not just endure his captivity, he leveraged it, using the pirate's own greed to establish a higher valuation for himself, and then executing a flawless, ruthless plan to demonstrate the consequences of underestimating him. He had established his personal brand, audacious, brilliant, and absolutely lethal when crossed. This act raises the central question of his entire story. How did a man turn his own kidnapping into the first proof of concept for his terrifying ambition? To truly comprehend the mind of this founder, this Caesar, we must first analyse the broken market he was preparing to enter, the crumbling institution he intended to dismantle from within. Rome, in the 1st century BC, was a system on the verge of total collapse. Its core operating system, the Republican Constitution, was hopelessly outdated. It had been designed centuries earlier to govern a small, homogeneous city-state, a community of farmer soldiers who shared a common culture and purpose. But it was now buckling under the strain of managing a global empire stretching from Spain to Syria, from the Rhine frontier to the deserts of Africa. The administrative machinery required to govern hundreds of diverse cultures, manage complex international supply chains for grain and metals, and defend thousands of miles of borders simply did not exist. The simple, elegant code of the early republic was now riddled with critical bugs, and the system was flashing fatal error warnings that the establishment willfully ignored. The entire Roman world was a volatile mess. The first critical bug was the existence of an entrenched elite, the Senate, who had consolidated nearly all the wealth and political power. They were the legacy board of directors, the optimates, or best men, a closed-off class of aristocratic families who viewed the state not as a public trust, but as a private portfolio to be managed for their exclusive benefit. They maintained their grip not just through wealth and tradition, but by monopolizing the levers of institutional power, controlling the high priesthoods to manipulate state religion for political ends, and using their dominance of the courts to prosecute and neutralize any upstart who threatened their cartel. They were pathologically resistant to any change, any system update that might threaten their stock options or dilute their authority. They governed through tradition, inertia, and, when necessary, brutal violence, ensuring that the vast resources of the empire, taxes from conquered provinces, mineral wealth from Spanish mines, grain from Egypt, flowed into their coffers while the foundations of the state eroded beneath them. This concentration of wealth had created the latifundia, massive agricultural estates worked by legions of slaves, which had driven the small independent Italian farmer, the traditional backbone of the Roman army and citizenry, into bankruptcy. The second, and perhaps more dangerous bug, was the presence of a massive, restless and disenfranchised population. The endless wars of expansion had ruined the small Italian farmer, forcing millions off their land and into the sprawling, chaotic slums of Rome. They were the ignored user base, a vast sea of the urban poor known as the proletarii, military veterans with no land to return to, and provincials with no rights. huddled in rickety, flammable apartment blocks in districts like the Subura. They faced chronic unemployment, disease, and starvation. Their survival dependent on an unreliable state grain dole. They were angry, they were hungry, and they were ready to click unsubscribe on the entire Republican system, preferably with fire and steel. Their loyalty was no longer to the abstract idea of the Republic, but to any charismatic leader who promised them a better deal, be it grain subsidies, land grants, or simply a share of the spoils. This volatile combination of an ossified, self-serving elite and an enraged, desperate populace meant that the Republic was not a stable state. It was a powder keg waiting for a spark. The streets of Rome were no longer a forum for civic debate, but a battleground for politically motivated gangs, and the courts were weaponized for partisan prosecutions. The system was sick, and everyone knew it. Now, Rome had seen would-be reformers before. It had seen men who tried to patch the system, to address its most glaring injustices. The Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, a century earlier, had attempted to implement land reforms to give public land back to the poor and the veterans who had conquered it. Their agenda was a direct threat to the wealthy landowners in the Senate, Sena, who had illegally occupied and profited from this public land for generations. The Senate's response was not debate, it was assassination. They declared a state of emergency, a legal loophole allowing them to suspend civil liberties, and had them and thousands of their followers beaten to death in the streets, their bodies tossed into the Tiber like refuse. This act did more than just eliminate reformers. It shattered a foundational principle of the Republic. It introduced political murder as a tool of statecraft, creating a precedent that would haunt Roman politics for the next 100 years. Gaius Marius, a brilliant general from outside the traditional aristocracy, had saved Rome from Germanic invasions by opening the army to the landless poor, creating a professional fighting force. But this necessary reform had a fatal side effect. It created armies loyal to their generals, who provided them with pay, plunder, and retirement benefits, not to the state, which provided nothing. The Marian reforms essentially privatized the military, turning legions into the personal instruments of ambitious commanders. The bond between soldier and general became stronger than the bond between soldier and state, a systemic vulnerability that would be exploited again and again. The system, fearing his power and popularity with the people, turned on him, forcing him into exile and precipitating a bloody civil war protive against his rival, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. The case of Sulla was perhaps the most instructive precedent for Caesar. Sulla, a champion of the Optimates, had done the unthinkable. He marched his own army on Rome, seized the city, and declared himself dictator. He then unleashed a reign of terror known as the Proscriptions, posting lists of his political enemies whose property was confiscated and who could be killed on sight for a reward. It was a brutal, systematic purge of his opponents. This wasn't just random violence. It was a calculated campaign of political and financial destruction, creating a climate of pervasive fear that paralyzed all opposition and enriched Sulla's own followers. Possibly, after, remodeling the state to drastically increase the power of the Senate and cripple the institutions of the people, Sulla did something even more astonishing. He voluntarily relinquished his dictatorial power and retired to private life. Sulla had proven that a powerful general could bend the Republic to his will. He had created a playbook for a military takeover, but his ultimate goal was conservative, to restore the primacy of the very aristocratic elite that was strangling the state. The pattern was clear and brutal. Rome had an established non-negotiable policy for disruptive innovators. It killed them. It crushed them before their ideas could gain traction. Caesar knew these stories intimately. His own family had been on the losing side of the Sullan civil wars. His uncle by marriage was Marius, and Sulla had nearly had the teenage Caesar himself proscribed, sparing him only reluctantly, reportedly saying, "In this boy I see many Mariuses." This was no idle threat. It was a formative near-death experience. Caesar studied their failures like a modern entrepreneur analyzes the case studies of failed startups. He understood their fatal mistakes. They either confronted the Senate head-on too early, or they failed to build a power base independent of the very institutions they sought to reform. This leads us to the most critical question of his early career. What was Caesar's unique business plan that would allow him to succeed where all others had been brutally eliminated? How would he not only survive the system's lethal antibodies, but make that same system adore him even as he was preparing its destruction? Caesar didn't just harbour ambition. He possessed something far rarer, a meticulous multi-phase strategy for total market dominance. It was a business plan so audacious, so patient, and so brilliantly executed that its true scope was not understood by his competitors until it was far too late. His plan, Project Caesar, can be broken down into a three-point strategy, executed over decades. The first part was customer acquisition. Caesar understood, with a clarity that eluded his peers, that the disenfranchised people of Rome were not a mob to be feared, but a target market to be captured. He consciously cultivated the image of a champion of the populares, the political faction that advocated for the common people, constantly reminding everyone of his connection to the great Marius. While serving as aedile, the official responsible for public games and works, he went into catastrophic personal debt, what we would today call burning through venture capital, to stage the most spectacular gladiatorial games, theatrical performances, and public festivals Rome had ever witnessed. He rebuilt public colonnades and funded them with his own borrowed money. His gladiatorial contests were not just numerous, they featured combatants in gleaming silver armour, a touch of showmanship that dazzled the crowds. Another masterstroke was his campaign for the office of Pontifex Maximus, the High Priest of Rome. It was a position of immense prestige and influence, held for life. Against all odds, and by spending ruinous amounts of borrowed money on bribes, he won, securing a permanent sacrosanct platform at the very heart of the Roman establishment. He was not just buying their votes with bread and circuses, he was building a fanatical brand loyalty. He was cultivating an emotional connection that no aloof, tradition-bound senator could ever hope to match. He made himself the celebrity CEO of the Roman people, a charismatic figure who understood and catered to their desires. His debts became legendary, reaching a staggering 1,300 talents at one point. When a creditor threatened to stop him from leaving for his provincial governorship in Spain, Caesar simply turned to the richest man in Rome, Crassus, who underwrote the debt. Caesar understood that in the high-stakes game of Roman politics, massive debt was not a liability, but proof of his immense ambition, and a tool to bind powerful men like Crassus to his success. The second part was product development. While the Senate was mired in petty political squabbles in Rome, Caesar secured for himself a provincial command in a place most saw as a dangerous, unprofitable backwater, Gaul. This was not a demotion. It was his off-site R&D lab. For 8 grueling years he poured all his energy into forging his killer app, a private army, hardened by constant warfare and bound to him by an unbreakable personal loyalty. He fought against a complex and formidable array of opponents, from the migrating Helvetii to the disciplined Belgae, and ultimately a pan-Gallic confederation led by the brilliant Arvernian chieftain Vercingetorix. He fought alongside his men, he knew their names, he ate the same rations, and most importantly he made them rich with the spoils of conquest. He doubled their standard pay out of his own pocket. He transformed the legions under his command from a state-sponsored military force into a personal corporate security team, a fanatically devoted brotherhood. They were not loyal to the abstract concept of the Roman Senate, they were loyal to the death to Julius Caesar. The hardships they endured together, brutal winters, grueling marches and terrifying battles against fearsome Celtic warriors, forged a bond that transcended mere employment. They were shareholders in his enterprise, and their dividends were paid in glory and gold. The third and final part of his initial strategy was to neutralize the competition through strategic mergers. Caesar knew he was not yet powerful enough to take on the entire establishment alone. The senatorial elite, the optimates, were a powerful, entrenched cartel. So, he engineered an alliance that was a stroke of political genius, the first triumvirate. Think of it as a merger of the three most powerful and disruptive startups in Rome, each bringing a unique asset to the table. This informal but potent soyuz, alliance, was formed in 60 BC. He brought in Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, a titan of finance who had crushed the Spartacus rebellion. Crassus was his angel investor, providing the capital and financial leverage needed to operate and counter the Senate's financial clout. He then brought in Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey the Great, Pompey, the most celebrated military hero of the age, who had conquered vast territories in the east. Pompey was the established blue-chip partner who provided unparalleled market credibility and military prestige. Pompey, however, felt betrayed by the Senate, which, jealous of his success, had refused to ratify his eastern settlements or provide land for his veteran soldiers. Caesar promised to deliver what the Senate denied. To the Optimate establishment, this alliance was an unconstitutional monstrosity, a private pact between three individuals to hijack the state and override the legitimate authority of the Senate. It was, in their eyes, the ultimate confirmation of Caesar's tyrannical ambitions. Together, this triumvirate of Caesar's political cunning, Crassus's wealth, and Pompey's reputation was too powerful for the Senate to block. They effectively controlled the state, bypassing the traditional levers of power to push through their own agendas, securing Caesar's command in Gaul and fulfilling Pompey's and Crassus's demands. It was a brilliant plan, a masterpiece of political engineering, but a pitch deck is worthless without execution. Now we must turn to the legendary moments where Caesar took his meticulously crafted plan live, proving his concept on the world stage. The conquest of Gaul was the longest and most successful product launch in human history. It was here, during this crucial time, that Caesar scaled his operation from a promising political startup into a global powerhouse. For 8 years, the Gallic Wars provided him with everything his plan required. First, it generated immense wealth. The plunder from hundreds of conquered towns and tribes, including vast quantities of gold and an estimated 1 million people sold into slavery, allowed him to pay off his astronomical debts in Rome and, more importantly, to ensure his soldiers were the best paid and best equipped in the world. He used this wealth to buy influence back in Rome, funding public buildings and providing lavish handouts to sway key political players. Second, it perfected his product, a battle-hardened army of veterans who knew only him as their leader. The Gallic campaigns were a brutal forge, transforming his legions into the most efficient and deadly fighting force on the planet. He demanded absolute discipline, but also fostered incredible initiative in his centurions. His tactical genius was proven time and again, most famously at the Siege of Alesia, where he defeated a massive Gallic relief army by building 2 concentric rings of fortifications, simultaneously besieging the Gallic stronghold from within and fighting off a numerically superior enemy from without. The scale of this engineering feat was staggering. Over 20 miles of walls, towers, trenches, and hidden traps, all constructed by his soldiers in a matter of weeks. Their loyalty was absolute, forged in the crucible of shared danger and shared victory. Finally, the campaign built his personal brand into something mythic. His dispatches from the front, the Commentari de Bello Gallico, commentaries on the Gallic War, were masterfully crafted pieces of propaganda. Written in a crisp, unadorned Latin style, they appeared to be objective, third-person reports, but were in fact a carefully constructed narrative that highlighted his own military genius, his clemency to the defeated, and the existential threats he was neutralizing on Rome's behalf. These reports were read aloud in the forum, turning his military campaign into a serialized adventure story for the Roman people. He was directly shaping his own public image in real time, bypassing the hostile senatorial media to speak directly to his customer base. He was no longer just another ambitious politician. He was a living legend, the conqueror who had added a vast new territory to Rome and subdued its most feared enemies. While he was developing his assets in Gaul, the political situation in Rome was deteriorating. The triumvirate, the strategic merger that had enabled his rise, began to fracture. The personal and political ties that held the uneasy Soyuz together started to snap one by one. Crassus, his angel investor, seeking his own military glory to rival Pompey's and Caesar's, launched a disastrous campaign against the Parthian Empire in the east, and was killed at the Battle of Carrhae, his head reportedly used as a prop in a play. Crassus had been the financial centre of gravity and the political buffer between the two military titans. With him gone, Caesar and Pompey began to drift into opposing orbits. A more personal blow came with the death of Caesar's daughter Julia, who had been married to Pompey to seal their alliance. She died in childbirth, and with her went the strongest personal link between the two ambitious men. The personal and political ties binding Caesar and Pompey dissolved. The Senate, seeing its chance, began to court Pompey, positioning him as the defender of the Republic against the dangerously popular and powerful Caesar. They showered Pompey with honours and convinced him that his former ally was now his greatest rival, a rogue general whose ambition threatened the very fabric of the state. The chaos in Rome, fueled by warring street gangs, provided the perfect pretext for the Senate to grant Pompey unprecedented powers as sole consul to restore order. The board of directors was now aligning with one powerful executive to oust the other. The old guard finally realised their catastrophic mistake. They saw Caesar's power growing beyond their control and they panicked. They had watched him conquer a nation and amass a fortune, all while building a private army that worshipped him. They issued an ultimatum, a non-negotiable demand sent to him in his winter camp: disband your army, relinquish your command, and return to Rome as a private citizen to stand trial for your actions as consul. For them, it was a checkmate. Stripped of his command and the legal immunity it granted, Caesar would be immediately prosecuted by his enemies on charges of corruption and illegal warfare, his career ruined, and his life forfeit. To comply meant political annihilation and probable execution at the hands of his enemies. To refuse meant being declared an enemy of the state, a traitor to the Republic. This was it, the moment of truth, the culmination of a decade of planning. He stood with his loyal 13th Legion on the banks of a small, insignificant river called the Rubicon. This stream marked the legal boundary of Italy proper. Under Roman law, it was an unforgivable act of treason for a general to cross it with an army. It was an explicit declaration of war against the state, against the Senate, and against Pompey. Think about this for a moment. Everything you have built, your reputation, your wealth, your loyal army, is on one side of this river. On the other side lies political oblivion, the loss of everything you have worked for, and almost certain death. Do you trust the very system that has just conspired to destroy you, or do you bet everything, absolutely everything, on yourself and your team? Suetonius reports that Caesar hesitated, grappling with the enormity of the step he was about to take, saying, "Even yet we may turn back." But Kagda, when the moment came, his resolve hardened. Caesar's face was set, a mask of grim determination. He gave a slight nod. His horse stepped into the cold water. He is said to have uttered 5 words that would forever alter the course of Western civilization. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. He was not just initiating a civil war. He was clicking execute on the final irreversible phase of his hostile takeover of the Roman Republic. He won. The takeover was, by every conceivable measure, a resounding success. The civil war was swift and decisive. Caesar's legendary speed, his celeritas, caught his opponents completely off guard. While they expected him to amass his full army, he raced down the Italian peninsula with just 1 legion. causing town after town to open its gates to him without a fight. Pompey and the majority of the Senate, panicked and unprepared, abandoned Italy and fled east to Greece to raise an army. Caesar secured Italy, then, in a brilliant campaign, swung west to Spain to defeat Pompey's veteran legions there before turning east to confront Pompey himself. He outmaneuvered and defeated the numerically superior armies of Pompey and the Senate at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece. Pompey fled to Egypt, only to be assassinated by advisors to the young king Ptolemy XIII, who hoped to curry favour with the victor. It was a move that Caesar famously met with sorrow, not triumph, executing Pompey's killers and restoring the rival queen, Cleopatra, to the throne. He swept through the remaining pockets of resistance in Africa and Spain, returning to Rome not as a bloody conqueror in the mould of Sulla, but as a reconciler, a figure of strength who promised to end the chaos. He now controlled the company, from the top floor to the mailroom. He was declared dictator perpetuo, dictator for life, and he immediately began launching a series of radical system updates. He reformed the hopelessly inaccurate calendar, creating the Julian calendar that, with minor adjustments, we still use today. He launched massive public works projects, rebuilding cities and creating jobs for the urban poor. He planned to build a great library in Rome to rival Alexandria's, to codify Roman law, and to launch vast infrastructure projects like draining the Pontine marshes to create new farmland. He granted citizenship to people in the provinces, expanding the Roman franchise and integrating the empire more fully. He resettled his veterans in colonies across the empire and gave land to the urban poor, addressing the root cause of the social unrest that had plagued the Republic for a century. He streamlined government, reduced debt, and planned grand new campaigns to secure the empire's frontiers. He was, in essence, systematically fixing the bugs that had caused the Republic to crash. This brings us to the final bloody paradox of Julius Caesar's life. The men who gathered around him on the floor of the Senate on the Ides of March, with daggers concealed within the folds of their togas, were not just his long-standing political enemies. Many of them, including the man he considered like a son, Marcus Junius Brutus, were individuals he had defeated in the civil war. They were Pompey's allies, men who had fought him on the battlefield. Yet, instead of executing them as was the custom, as Sulla had done without hesitation, Caesar had publicly forgiven them. He had restored their property, reinstated them in the Senate, and even given them positions of power in his new administration. This policy of clementia, or mercy, was a strategic masterpiece, an act designed to heal the wounds of civil war, consolidate his power through magnanimity, and show that his rule would be one of stability, not terror. It was a deliberate rejection of the Solon model of prescription and bloodshed. It should have been his ultimate strength, the final proof that he was a benevolent unifier, not a tyrant. So we must ask the final, tragic question. Why did this act of mercy, which should have secured his reign, become the very weapon that was used to destroy him? The conspirators saw his mercy not as strength, but as a condescending display of absolute power, the power to give life as easily as to take it. For a proud Roman aristocrat, whose entire identity was built on competition and peerage, to be pardoned by a superior was a public humiliation, a constant reminder of their defeat and his supremacy. Their concept of libertas was not about universal freedom, but about the freedom of the elite to contend for the state's highest honours, a freedom that one-man rule made impossible. They believed they were living as subjects of a king, not as citizens of a republic. His accumulation of honours, the title of Father of the Fatherland, his face on coins, a statue placed among the kings of old, all pointed to an undeclared monarchy, the most reviled concept in Roman political thought. They believed killing the man, the Caesar, would kill the idea of one-man rule. They thought they were rebooting the Republic. They were profoundly wrong. His death did not restore the old system. It crashed it permanently and irrevocably. The assassination on the floor of the Senate was not a clean, surgical strike that restored liberty. It was a bloody, panicked butchery that unleashed another 13 years of brutal, chaotic civil war that utterly destroyed what was left of the old republic. The conspirators had no plan for what came next, no strategy for governing postly after Caesar's death. They had fatally misjudged the market. The people of Rome did not rejoice at the death of their tyrant. They were enraged by the murder of their champion. At Caesar's funeral, his loyal lieutenant Mark Antony read his will, which left his gardens to the public and a sum of money to every Roman citizen. The mob, inflamed with grief and rage, drove the assassins from the city. The assassination created a power vacuum so vast that only one man could ultimately fill it: his grandnephew and adopted heir, a brilliant and ruthless teenager named Octavian. Octavian formed a new alliance, the Second Triumvirate, with Antony and Lepidus. Unlike his great-uncle, Octavian had learned a different lesson from history. Where Caesar had shown clemency, Octavian and his allies unleashed a new and far more terrible wave of proscriptions, systematically hunting down and executing not only the assassins, but thousands of their political and personal enemies, including the great orator Cicero. They were not interested in forgiveness. They were liquidating the assets of the old regime. They annihilated the old guard that Caesar had spared. In the end, Caesar's most effective exit strategy was one he never planned. The assassin's daggers ended the life of the man, but in doing so they deified the legend. By shattering the fragile peace Caesar had imposed, they proved his central thesis. The Republic was broken beyond repair and could not be saved. Their act of liberation paved the way for a system of even more absolute authority, creating the blueprint for the Roman Empire. Caesar failed to become a king, but his name, Caesar, became the very title for emperor, a word that would echo through the corridors of power in Rome, in Constantinople, in Moscow as Tsar, and in Berlin as Kaiser for the next 2 millennia. The legacy of Caesar's name outlasted the empire he never got to rule. He lost the battle on the Ides of March, but he won the war for history. He didn't just disrupt a market or execute a hostile takeover, he designed the core operating system for the next chapter of human civilization. He hacked Rome, and in doing so, reshaped the world. His life became the ultimate startup story, a venture so successful it outgrew its founder and became the new global standard. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel, like, share, and subscribe. Please leave a comment telling us what you think of this video. If you enjoyed this video, please support the channel, like, share, and subscribe. Please leave a comment telling us what you think of this video.